Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 9, Social Influence, which is the term for the many ways that people affect one another by changing their attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and behavior. For example, fashion trends, getting a favor, following orders, replying to a request, etc. There are three basic types of social influence. One of these is conformity, when we change our behavior, our beliefs, our attitudes in response to pressure from others. This is not a direct request, but we feel social pressure because other people are doing something. The classic example is, of course, fashion trends. How else would we explain the styles that I wore in the 1970s? A second type of social influence is compliance, where we respond to an explicit request by another person. Someone asks us to do something, and we agree to do it. Finally, there is obedience, in which a person with more power demands or orders someone to do something. For example, people in the military are required to follow the orders of their superiors. Each of these can be used for good or perhaps evil purposes. For example, conformity works well to get people to form a line at the theater, to drive on the correct side of the road, to open the door for other people. On the other hand, conformity can get people to do things like engage in a riot, try a new drug that their friends are using, etc. Sometimes people conform automatically. That is, they behave unconsciously in response to other people's behavior. We call this automatic mimicry. For example, when we behave in the same way, follow the same habits or idiosyncrasies of another person, why would we do that? William James, in 1890, explained it this way. He said that the reason we behave like other people is that merely seeing somebody doing something makes it more likely that we'll behave the same way. He called this ideomotor action. For example, if we see a commercial on TV for a particular food, we might want to get that food or to get some food. People also mimic others as a way to grease the social wheels. For example, people who have a strong drive to affiliate with other people are more likely to mimic them. People who mimic others tend to be liked better. People who are mimicked engage in more pro-social behavior afterwards. In other words, if somebody mimics us, we tend to be kinder afterwards. For example, this study from 1999 found that people were more likely to engage in an activity after a research confederate, that is, an assistant to the researcher, performed that particular action. Social influence can serve both informational and normative functions. Informational social influence is when other people give us information about the correct or proper way to do something. Sherif demonstrated this in a 1936 study of the autokinetic illusion. The autokinetic phenomenon is our tendency to see a stationary light start to move when it's in a dark room. That is, it appears to move automatically, even though it is stationary. As seen in the graph, participants' estimates of how far the light moved tend to converge over time. By the third trial, their estimates were essentially the same. Of course, social influence is not always providing us with information. It tends to when there is an ambiguous or uncertain situation and when we feel like we don't know much about the topic. Besides information, social influences can serve a normative function. This is when we want to fit in. We don't want to be excluded or teased or subject to other kinds of social sanctions. The classic study of this is Solomon Asch's 1956 line length study. A true subject was taken into a room with 7 Confederates. They were asked to judge the length of lines, as seen here. Given the target line, they were asked to select which of the test lines was the same length. In this case, it is B. In the group of 7 Confederates, there was one who on some trials gave the wrong answer. Of the true participants, the true research subjects, a full 75% agreed with this wrong answer, that is, they conformed at least once. And overall, conformity occurred in 33% of the times that the Confederate gave the wrong answer. You might think that increasing the number of people who are in the group that is trying to make you conform would have a bigger effect, but it turns out that groups above 3 or 4 have no more effect than those of that size. Conformity also decreases when a group is not unanimous. Cultural effects as well. Members of interdependent cultures, collectivists that is, are more concerned about fitting in and therefore more likely to conform. Similarly, tight cultures where norms are very clear and there is a great deal of sanction for violating them tend to induce more conformity than looser cultures. There are other factors that affect conformity as well. When we know people are acting out of self-interest or bias, we're less likely to conform. Also, when we have a very obvious explanation for why our opinion is different, we may be less likely to conform. The majority in a group can sometimes be convinced of the minority position when that minority opinion is consistent and provides information that the group does not have. Moving on to the second type of social influence, compliance. This is when we agree to a request from another person. That is, someone asks us to do something and we do so. One reason for this is what's called reciprocity. In most societies, people believe that we should benefit people who have benefited us. In other words, if we do someone a favor, the expectation is they'll do the same for us later. One example of this is the door in the face technique, also known as reciprocal concession. You ask somebody for a very large favor. They turn you down, and you ask them for a smaller favor. The reason this works is that people think, well, you compromised, so I'll compromise. An example of this might be when a salesperson offers you the most expensive version of the product you're looking at. You don't choose that, but you end up buying something more expensive than you planned. The flip side of this is the foot in the door technique. People make a small request that someone agrees to, and that person is more likely to agree to a bigger request later. People need to justify to themselves what they've done. So if I gave $5 last year to a charity, I must support that charity, and so when they ask me for $10 this year, I'm more likely to give it to them. Our emotions can also affect the likelihood that we'll comply with a request from someone. Both positive and sometimes negative moods can increase the rates with which people comply. In this study from Eisen, Clark, and Schwartz in 1976, individuals who were given a small gift were more likely to comply with a request. But this good mood effect wore off very quickly after a few minutes. Sometimes being in a bad mood can increase compliance. If the request is something that will cause us to feel better about ourselves, we're more likely to comply to relieve our negative mood at the time. Guilt can also induce compliance. People do not like to feel guilty and will often comply with a request if it reduces their current feelings of guilt. Another way to increase compliance is to use normative behavior as an anchor point to get people to seek out that normative anchor. However, one has to be careful with this. In this study from Schultz et al. In 2007, people were provided information about how their electricity use was related to the typical family use. People who had been using more than average tended to decrease their use when given feedback. However, those who were using less than average increased their usage subsequent to the information, unless they were also given a smiley face on their bill. So very subtle changes can have big effects. There are different kinds of norms that we use to gauge behavior. Descriptive norms are what people typically do in a given context. Prescriptive, on the other hand, are the expectations we have about what people should do. These are sometimes also called injunctive norms. On now to the third type of social influence, obedience to authority. The seminal study in this area was that conducted by the American psychologist Stanley Milgram. It is one of the most informative and yet most disturbing of the experiments that we'll talk about in this course. Participants were recruited from newspaper ads and showed up at the experiment to study learning. What they didn't know was that the study of learning was going to measure the effect of punishment on learning. When the participants entered the laboratory, there was another ostensible participant in the room and a researcher. The other participant was, in fact, an actor. Both people were told that one of them would serve as a teacher and one as a learner. In fact, the real participant was always chosen to be the teacher. The learner was taken to another room and strapped into a chair hooked up to a machine that delivered electric shocks. The teacher was told that they would teach the learner a set of word pairs and then test them. Each time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher was to provide an electric shock, starting from a very low level and moving up to a level that was potentially lethal. No shocks were actually delivered. The learner provided a scripted set of wrong answers on a recording that he played in response to the teacher's actions. During the experiment, the learner begins to scream in pain and make increasingly urgent demands to be let out of the room. Finally, he stops responding at all, and the teacher is instructed to continue to provide shocks for non-answers, which were to be counted as wrong. When teachers expressed reluctance to continue, the experimenter told them one of three things which were increasingly strong demands that they continue. Frighteningly, 62.5% of participants went all the way to the highest level of shock, even though it was marked potentially lethal and even though the learner had stopped responding. Milgram found the same results for different ages, different social classes, men and women. The findings were relatively consistent. However, the effects depend on the situational factors involved. Changing the demands of the experiment changed the results dramatically. Obedience declines in a number of circumstances. If the learner is in the same room as the teacher, if the teacher has to physically apply the shock to the learner, and if the experimenter is giving instructions by phone, rather than in person, obedience declines. The closer the experimenter is, the more compliance. The closer the learner is, the less compliance. Milgram's results were shocking and disturbing, to say the least. Most people think that they would not have obeyed, and yet the experiment has been repeated and found relatively the same level of obedience. There are many instances in which individuals do things that they cannot imagine they would have done beforehand. History is full of examples of horrific behavior by individuals to other groups of people. One of the most important findings from Milgram's work is that people are willing to do what they would otherwise consider to be objectionable actions if someone else takes responsibility. Just following orders is the excuse that allows people to do things that they find personally repugnant. One of the other factors involved in Milgram's results was the foot in the door technique. People started with a low level of shock and continued to higher levels. Each time, one could justify one's actions by saying to themselves, I used the lower level and everything was okay, so I'll go up a step. I hope that this week's lecture has given you much to think about, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.